The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly in room 214 of Riverview Academy, casting a cold, artificial glow over the neatly arranged desks. At the front of the room stood Mrs. Eleanor Hargrove, a teacher known for her meticulousness and unyielding control. Her chestnut brown hair, streaked with silver, was twisted into a bun so tight it seemed to mirror her personality. She tapped her clipboard rhythmically against her palm, a conductor orchestrating a symphony of obedience. "In this classroom," she began, her voice sharp and authoritative, "we strive for excellence through discipline and order. There is no room for chaos. Excellence is a choice, and you will all make that choice." Her heels clacked decisively as she moved between the rows of students. Every eye was on her, though not all were filled with respect. Eleanor Hargrove didn't just demand obedience, she extracted it like a surgeon removing a splinter. Most students bowed under her scrutiny, but not Jordan Bennett. Sitting in the second row, his back was straight, his chin slightly raised, and his expression calm yet unyielding. Jordan had been warned about her. Other kids whispered stories of favoritism, how Mrs. Hargrove's discipline was harsher for certain students who, like Jordan, stood out in the predominantly white classroom. But his father had always told him, "Respect yourself, and don't let anyone diminish you." And so, Jordan met her gaze without flinching. "Now," Mrs. Hargrove continued, her sharp eyes scanning the room, "I trust you've all completed your assigned reading on the early days of America's colonization." Her tone carried a subtle bite as she added, "Perhaps we'll begin with someone who may have found the material challenging." The room tensed. Though she didn't name names, the implication hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. Jordan felt a flicker of anger in his chest, but he refused to show it. Instead, he raised his hand calmly. "Ah, Mr. Bennett," she said, her voice tinged with suspicion. "I trust you have something insightful to share?" "Yes, ma'am," Jordan replied evenly, his voice steady. "I found it curious how the textbook avoids discussing certain truths about colonization, like how the displacement of native peoples is glossed over. It's like the history is only being told from one side." A ripple of murmurs spread through the class. Some students exchanged wide-eyed glances, others hid smiles behind their hands. Jordan's confidence struck a nerve with Mrs. Hargrove, whose lips pressed into a thin, disapproving line. "We follow the curriculum here, Mr. Bennett," she said curtly, her voice cold enough to chill the air, "and it is not your place to critique it." Jordan leaned back in his chair, the ghost of a smile on his face. "Understood, Mrs. Hargrove. Just thought it was worth mentioning." Her jaw tightened, and she moved on. But the tension in the room lingered. Jordan's classmates shot him furtive glances, admiration mixing with apprehension. In the principal's office, Mrs. Hargrove paced furiously, her heels clicking on the polished floor. Principal William Carter, a tall, composed man in his early 50s, watched her from his desk, his expression calm but guarded. "That Jordan Bennett is becoming a problem," she declared, dropping into a chair with a huff. "He's disruptive, argumentative, and undermines my authority at every turn." Principal Carter raised an eyebrow. "Jordan Bennett, the same Jordan Bennett who leads the debate team, maintains a 4.0 GPA, and volunteers with our community outreach program?" "Grades aren't everything," Mrs. Hargrove snapped. "The boy is a troublemaker in disguise, sowing seeds of defiance among the other students." "Or perhaps," Carter suggested gently, "he's demonstrating the critical thinking skills we encourage here." Mrs. Hargrove's face flushed, and she stood abruptly. "If you won't back me, then don't blame me when things spiral out of control." Principal Carter watched her leave, a flicker of concern crossing his otherwise composed features. After school, Jordan sat on the bleachers with his best friend, Tasha Green, as the autumn breeze swept fallen leaves across the empty football field. Tasha hugged her books tightly, her curly hair framing a face full of worry. "Did you see how she looked at me when I asked about the homework?" Tasha asked, her voice quiet. "Like she couldn't believe I'd even understand the question." Jordan clenched his jaw. "She does that all the time. It's like she's constantly trying to remind us we don't belong." Tasha sighed. "But she's a teacher, Jordan. What can we do? Jordan turned to her, his eyes steady. We don't let her win. We don't let her make us feel small. My dad always says silence is just as bad as complicity. If we don't stand up, who will? Tasha bit her lip, uncertainty clouding her face. But standing up comes with consequences. And so does staying quiet, Jordan replied firmly. The next morning, the tension in Mrs. Hargrove's history class was palpable. She stood at the whiteboard writing the civil rights movement in bold letters. Turning to the class, she fixed her gaze on Jordan. "Mr. Bennett," she said, her voice clipped. "Since you seem to have such strong opinions, why don't you tell us about the effectiveness of peaceful protests during the civil rights era?" Jordan met her gaze without hesitation. Peaceful protests were powerful because they exposed the injustice of those in power. Dr. King and others knew that showing dignity under attack would force the world to see the truth. "And do you think nonviolence was always the best approach?" she asked, her tone almost mocking. "Wouldn't a more forceful response have been justified?" Jordan's classmates shifted uncomfortably. He paused, then answered. "Sometimes peaceful resistance requires more strength than aggression. It's about choosing a higher path even when it's hard." Mrs. Hargrove's face turned red. "And what makes you an expert on this subject, Mr. Bennett?" "I've read a lot about it," he said calmly. "My dad made sure I knew my history." The class chuckled softly. Mrs. Hargrove's composure cracked and she snapped, "That's enough, Mr. Bennett. You're disrupting the class again." But Jordan only sat taller in his chair, unshaken. Her patience finally snapped. Crossing the room in 3 quick strides, she raised her hand and slapped him hard across the face. The room went silent, gasps echoing as the sound of the slap lingered in the air. At the back of the class, someone's phone quietly recorded everything. Jordan's cheek burned, but he didn't flinch. He locked eyes with her and said evenly, "You've made a mistake. My dad is your boss." Mrs. Hargrove's face drained of color as the implications hit her. Around her, students stared in stunned silence, and the weight of what she had done began to sink in. The silence in the classroom was suffocating as Mrs. Hargrove stood frozen, her trembling hand still hovering in the air. The students exchanged wide-eyed glances, unable to process what they had just witnessed. In the back of the room, Amanda Carter, the quiet girl known for blending into the background, lowered her phone slightly, her screen still recording. Jordan sat calmly, his dark eyes locked on Mrs. Hargrove. Despite the stinging mark on his cheek, he remained composed. "I think you should sit down, Mrs. Hargrove," he said, his voice steady but cutting. "You've lost control of yourself." Mrs. Hargrove stumbled backward, her face pale. I didn't mean," she stammered, but her words faltered as she realized the gravity of the situation. The bell rang, startling everyone, but no one moved. Finally, Jordan gathered his books, stood and walked to the door. The other students hesitated for a moment, then began filing out silently. Amanda, clutching her phone tightly, slipped out last, her eyes darting between Jordan and Mrs. Hargrove. As the room emptied, Mrs. Hargrove sank into her chair, her hands trembling as they gripped the edge of her desk. Her meticulously controlled world had just collapsed in a single impulsive act. By the time Jordan left the school building, whispers were already spreading among the students. Amanda sat on the front steps, her phone open as a group of kids huddled around her. "Play it again," someone said, and she obliged, showing the video of Mrs. Hargrove's slap for the 5th time. Jordan approached, his face calm but his voice firm. "Amanda, let me see your phone." Amanda hesitated. I didn't mean to." "It's fine," Jordan said, holding out his hand. "I just want to see it." She handed him the phone, her fingers shaking slightly. Jordan watched the video, his jaw tightening. He could see the fiery redness of his cheek, the stunned reactions of his classmates, and Mrs. Hargrove's uncontrolled rage. The image was undeniable, irrefutable. "Are you going to send it to someone?" Amanda asked nervously. "No," Jordan said, handing the phone back to her. "But if you already have, don't delete it. People need to know the truth." Amanda nodded silently, her guilt easing as Jordan walked away. In the quiet of his home office, Marcus Bennett, Jordan's father, was reviewing a proposal for his firm when his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen to see a message from another parent at the school. It read, "Marcus, you need to see this. I thought you'd want to know what happened today." Attached was the video. He watched in growing disbelief, his grip tightening around the phone. When the slap rang out on the recording, his jaw clenched, and a cold fury washed over him. He played the video again, and then a third time, before standing abruptly and grabbing his car keys. In the living room, Jordan sat on the couch, staring at the blank television screen. His father entered, his normally warm demeanor replaced by a steely determination. "Jordan," he said, his voice low but intense. "Why didn't you tell me about this?" Jordan shrugged, not meeting his father's gaze. "I didn't want to make it a bigger deal than it already was." "Not a big deal?" Marcus's voice rose slightly. "A teacher assaulted you in front of your entire class. That's not something you just brush off." Jordan hesitated, then looked up. "I didn't want people to think I was weak." Marcus sat beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Standing up for yourself doesn't make you weak, son. It makes you strong. And standing up for what's right, especially when it's hard, makes you even stronger." Jordan's eyes glistened, but he held his composure. "What are we going to do?" Marcus's gaze hardened. "We're going to make sure she never does this to anyone else." The next morning, Riverview Academy buzzed with tension. Overnight, the video had spread through social media and group chats, sparking outrage among students, parents, and even staff. Local news outlets began picking up the story, adding fuel to the growing fire. In her classroom, Mrs. Hargrove sat at her desk staring at her inbox. Dozens of emails from furious parents flooded her account, their subject lines making her stomach churn. "How dare you?" read one. "You should be ashamed of yourself," declared another. The teacher's lounge, once her sanctuary, had turned cold. Conversations hushed when she entered, and colleagues avoided eye contact. Even Mr. Conway, her closest ally on the staff, mumbled a quick hello before walking away. At lunchtime, Principal Carter summoned Mrs. Hargrove to his office. She walked in with her head held high, but her confidence faltered when she saw the grim expressions on the faces of the school board members seated at the conference table. "Mrs. Hargrove," Principal Carter began, his tone grave, "we need to discuss the events of yesterday. The video of your actions has been brought to our attention, as well as numerous complaints from parents and former students. We've initiated a formal investigation, and effective immediately. You are suspended." Mrs. Hargrove's face flushed. "This is ridiculous," she snapped. "That boy has been undermining me for months. He provoked me." One of the board members, a composed woman with piercing eyes, interjected. "The video speaks for itself, Mrs. Hargrove. Regardless of provocation, there is no justification for striking a student." "I've given 20 years to this school," Mrs. Hargrove said, her voice cracking. "I won't let my career be destroyed over one moment." Principal Carter's voice softened slightly. "Eleanor, this isn't just one moment. We've received numerous complaints about your treatment of students over the years. This investigation is long overdue." Mrs. Hargrove stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "You'll regret this," she said, her voice shaking with both anger and desperation. "I'll take this to the media if I have to." That evening, Marcus Bennett invited other parents and students to their home to discuss their experiences with Mrs. Hargrove. The living room was filled with voices, some quiet, some angry, all sharing stories that painted a damning picture. "She always called me out for no reason," said Maria Rodriguez, her voice trembling. "And she'd make comments about how my English wasn't good enough. She told me I'd never make it to college," added Marcus Thompson, a senior, "that I should aim for something more realistic, like working in a trade." Jordan listened in silence, his resolve growing with every story. When it was his turn to speak, he stood and said, "We need to make sure this stops, not just for us, but for anyone else she might hurt. We can't stay silent." The room erupted in agreement, and a plan began to form. The following day, Riverview Academy was a powder keg waiting to explode. Parents flooded the school's front office with phone calls and emails demanding accountability. The video of Mrs. Hargrove's slap had not only gone viral, but had reached the local news stations, prompting reporters to gather outside the school gates. Inside the administrative building, Principal Carter met with the school board, his usually calm demeanor replaced with visible frustration. "The community is in uproar," he said, rubbing his temples. "And the more we dig, the worse this looks." Helen Martinez, the head of the school board, nodded grimly. "We've had over 20 formal complaints submitted in just the past 48 hours. Former students, parents, people who are finally willing to speak out now that the video has surfaced." One board member, a wiry man with a neatly trimmed beard, chimed in. "The pattern is clear. Mrs. Hargrove has been targeting minority students for years. This isn't just about one slap. It's about systemic bias." Principal Carter sighed heavily. "Then we have no choice but to take decisive action." Meanwhile, Mrs. Hargrove sat in her dimly lit living room, the curtains drawn tight. Her husband, David, hovered nearby, watching her with a mix of concern and exhaustion. "Karen," he said cautiously, "maybe it's time to step back. Take responsibility. Admit—" "Admit what?" she snapped, cutting him off. "That I've dedicated my entire life to these ungrateful children, only to have them turn on me?" David sighed. "You're not listening. This isn't just about one moment. There's a pattern here, Karen. People are coming forward." "They're lying," she shouted, slamming her coffee mug onto the table. "All of them. This is a witch hunt, and I'm the scapegoat." Her outburst was interrupted by a buzz from her phone. She picked it up to see an email from her lawyer. "Karen, we need to talk immediately. The board has escalated the investigation, and the media is asking for comments. Call me ASAP." Mrs. Hargrove clenched her fists. "If they think I'm going to go down without a fight, they're sorely mistaken." Back at the Bennett household, the parents' gathering had transformed into a community rallying point. Stories of Mrs. Hargrove's behavior were shared, each account adding another layer to the growing outrage. "She made me feel like I didn't belong," Maria Rodriguez repeated, her mother rubbing her back reassuringly, "like I'd never be good enough." Another parent, Mr. Lee, spoke up. "My son was in her class 3 years ago. She would constantly single him out during group projects, saying he needed to pull his weight, even though he was doing all the work." As the testimonies piled up, Marcus Bennett addressed the room. "We can't just let this go," he said, his voice firm. "This isn't about revenge. It's about ensuring no other child goes through what ours have. We need to demand action, not just against Mrs. Hargrove, but to reform how Riverview handles these situations." The group agreed, and by the end of the night they had drafted a petition calling for Mrs. Hargrove's dismissal and an independent review of the school's policies. It was shared online and gained hundreds of signatures within hours. 2 days later, the school board held a public meeting to address the escalating crisis. The gymnasium was packed with parents, students, teachers, and reporters, the tension in the air palpable. At the front of the room, Principal Carter and the school board sat behind a long table, their expressions solemn. "Thank you for coming," Helen Martinez began, her voice steady but firm. "We are here to address the allegations against Mrs. Eleanor Hargrove. Let me be clear. The safety and dignity of our students are our top priorities." As she spoke, murmurs rippled through the crowd. Near the back, Jordan sat with his father, his posture upright and his face calm. His classmates, Tasha and Amanda among them, sat nearby, offering silent support. Mrs. Hargrove entered the room moments later, her face tight with defiance. She took a seat at a small table set apart from the board, her lawyer whispering in her ear. As Helen Martinez outlined the complaints against her, Mrs. Hargrove's expression shifted from indignation to visible discomfort. "The investigation has revealed a pattern of behavior," Martinez continued, "one that spans years and has affected numerous students, particularly those from minority backgrounds. The video of the recent incident is deeply troubling, but it is only the tip of the iceberg. Mrs. Hargrove's lawyer stood to respond. My client has served this institution with dedication for over 2 decades. She maintains that the video does not represent the full context of the situation and denies the broader allegations. A parent stood abruptly, her voice shaking with emotion. My daughter came home crying almost every day because of Mrs. Hargrove. Are you saying her pain doesn't matter? Another parent followed. My son dropped out of honors classes because he couldn't stand the way she treated him. This isn't just one incident. It's a pattern. The room erupted in agreement, the collective anger and frustration of the community pouring out. Mrs. Hargrove shrank in her seat, her bravado crumbling under the weight of the crowd's condemnation. By the end of the meeting, the school board announced Mrs. Hargrove's immediate termination. The decision was met with applause from the audience, though it was clear that the fight for systemic change at Riverview was far from over. For Jordan, the days that followed were a whirlwind. News outlets reached out for interviews, and the school administration began implementing new diversity and inclusion training. Principal Carter personally apologized to Jordan and his father, promising that Riverview would do better. One evening, as Jordan sat on the porch with his dad, he asked, "Do you think things will really change?" Marcus nodded thoughtfully. Change takes time, but it starts with moments like this, when people refuse to stay silent. Jordan smiled faintly. I'm glad I spoke up. And I'm proud of you for it, his father said, clapping a hand on his shoulder. You've shown everyone what true strength looks like. Riverview Academy slowly began to heal. The students who had felt invisible under Mrs. Hargrove's reign found their voices, empowered by Jordan's courage. The school introduced new policies to ensure accountability, and teachers were required to undergo sensitivity training. As for Mrs. Hargrove, her career in education was effectively over. The lawsuit she threatened never materialized, and she quietly relocated, leaving the community she had once controlled so tightly. For Jordan, life didn't return to normal. It became something better. He became a leader at Riverview, his classmates rallying around him as a symbol of resilience and justice. And though the memory of that slap remained, it no longer haunted him. Instead, it became a reminder of his strength and the change that can come when one person refuses to back down. The air was heavy with emotion as parents and students gathered in Mr. Daniels's living room late into the evening. The stories shared by families painted a grim picture of Mrs. Collins's long history of discriminatory behavior and emotional abuse. Jordan sat quietly at first, absorbing the weight of the community's collective pain. Beside him, Tasha leaned in and whispered, "You're not alone in this. By speaking up, you're helping ensure no one else has to go through what we did." Jordan nodded, her words resonating deeply. As parents recounted incidents of humiliation and intimidation, a new resolve began to build in him. Some parents shed tears as they shared their children's experiences, while others voiced anger at how long Mrs. Collins had been allowed to continue teaching. Amidst the sadness and outrage, there was a flicker of hope, a shared belief that change was finally within reach. The next morning, Jordan sat at the kitchen table with his father and Tasha, discussing his upcoming testimony at the school board meeting. A plate of untouched toast sat in front of him as he toyed with his glass of orange juice. "I want to do it," Jordan said firmly. "Not just because of what she did to me, but because of everyone else, too." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "But I don't want this to be about revenge or about getting her fired. I want it to be about making things better." Mr. Daniels smiled, pride shining in his eyes. "What do you mean, son?" "I want to talk about ways to improve how we report teacher misconduct," Jordan explained. "About having regular check-ins with students to make sure they're being treated fairly, and about making sure teachers understand how much their words and actions can affect us." Tasha beamed at her friend. "That's perfect, Jordan. This isn't just about one teacher. It's about fixing the whole system. And that's exactly why your voice needs to be heard," Mr. Daniels added, placing a supportive hand on Jordan's shoulder. "You're not just thinking about yourself. You're thinking about making lasting change." Jordan nodded, the fear that had once threatened to overwhelm him now tempered by a growing sense of purpose. He wasn't fighting this battle alone, and that made all the difference. Meanwhile, in her lawyer's dimly lit office, Mrs. Collins clutched her purse tightly, her hands trembling. James Maxwell, her high-powered attorney, paced behind his desk, exuding a confidence that both unnerved and reassured her. "The only way out of this mess is to go on the offensive," Maxwell declared, leaning over his desk to emphasize his point. "We need to paint this kid as an attention seeker who's fabricating stories to ruin your career." "But there's a video," Mrs. Collins protested weakly. "Videos can be misleading," Maxwell said dismissively, waving his hand as though the footage were a mere inconvenience. "We'll argue that it was taken out of context. The real story is about a troubled student trying to destroy a dedicated teacher's reputation." Later that day, Mrs. Collins followed Maxwell's advice, making a series of carefully planned phone calls to influential parents within the school community. Her tone was dripping with false concern as she whispered, "I hate to say this, but Jordan has a history of disrupting class. This whole thing feels like another cry for attention." Her strategy, however, backfired spectacularly. Within hours, parents began sharing their own stories on social media and in local forums. One parent posted, "If Jordan's such a troublemaker, why does every other teacher praise him?" Another wrote, "My daughter had Mrs. Collins last year, and she came home crying almost every day. This isn't new." Despite the backlash, Maxwell took matters into his own hands. Without consulting Mrs. Collins, he leaked a fabricated email to local news stations. The doctored message appeared to show Jordan threatening Mrs. Collins before the incident. "I'll make you sorry," the fake email read, dated just days before the slap. The story exploded across local media. Headlines flashed, "Troubled student or victimized teacher." Social media erupted with heated debates, and the school's phone lines were flooded with calls from concerned parents. From her living room, Mrs. Collins watched the chaos unfold on the news, a mix of relief and guilt washing over her. She had momentarily shifted public attention, but the tide was already turning against her. More parents and former students continued to come forward, sharing stories of mistreatment that drowned out the temporary support the fake email had generated. "This is just making everything worse," Mrs. Collins muttered to herself, staring blankly at the television. Her reflection in the darkened screen looked haggard and defeated. For the first time, doubt began to creep into her mind. Had she gone too far? Unbeknownst to Mrs. Collins, Mr. Daniels was working tirelessly to expose the truth. Sitting in his home office, he scrolled through his contacts until he found Sarah Chen, a highly recommended private investigator. They met the next morning in a quiet cafe where Mr. Daniels explained the situation. "I need someone who can dig deep," he said. "There has to be a pattern here. Teachers like this don't just start behaving this way overnight." Sarah nodded, her sharp eyes gleaming with determination. "I'll start with her employment history. 3 schools in 10 years is unusual for a teacher with her credentials." Over the next several days, Sarah uncovered a disturbing pattern of behavior. Through a combination of interviews and records requests, she unearthed sealed complaints from Mrs. Collins's previous schools. Former administrators revealed how incidents of misconduct had been quietly swept under the rug, with settlements and non-disclosure agreements ensuring the complaints never went public. Each revelation painted an increasingly damning picture. Back at home, Jordan practiced his speech in his bedroom while his father listened attentively. Jordan's voice wavered at first, but Mr. Daniels offered steady guidance. "Remember, son," he said, "your strength is in your truth. You don't need to raise your voice to be heard." When the day of the school board meeting arrived, the tension was palpable. Parents, teachers, and community members packed the meeting room, with others standing along the walls. News cameras lined the back of the room, capturing every detail. Jordan approached the podium, adjusting the microphone as his classmates watched in silent support. Mrs. Collins sat in the back row, her face tight with barely contained anger. "Good evening," Jordan began, his voice clear and steady. "I'm here to tell you what happened in Mrs. Collins's classroom, but I'm also here to talk about something bigger." The room fell silent as Jordan recounted the events leading up to the slap. He described Mrs. Collins's pattern of targeting minority students, her attempts to humiliate him, and the moment she finally lost control. His composure never faltered, and his words carried a quiet strength that filled the room. "This isn't about revenge," Jordan concluded. "It's about making sure no other student has to feel unsafe in their classroom." A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd, and heads nodded in agreement. From her corner, Mrs. Collins' glare intensified, but Jordan didn't flinch. The dignity with which he spoke left no doubt about the truth of his words. The school board meeting buzzed with tension as Jordan's words hung in the air. Supportive murmurs rippled through the crowd, and several parents wiped away tears. Meanwhile, Mrs. Collins sat rigid in her chair, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. Her lawyer leaned over, whispering frantic suggestions, but she barely registered his words. As the board members prepared to question Jordan, Mr. Daniels stood and handed a thick folder to the chairwoman. "This is additional evidence we believe the board should review," he announced, his voice calm but firm. The chairwoman nodded, flipping through the folder's contents. Her face grew increasingly grave as she scanned the documents. "This evidence will be entered into the record," she said, her tone neutral but heavy with implication. The following morning, Sarah Chen, the private investigator, delivered her findings to the school board. She arrived with a box full of records, photographs, and affidavits from former students and staff who had experienced or witnessed Mrs. Collins' behavior. "The pattern is clear," Sarah began, addressing the board and the packed room. "Mrs. Collins has a documented history of targeting minority students and using discriminatory practices. These are not isolated incidents. They span multiple schools over the past decade." She clicked through a series of slides, each one detailing a new piece of evidence. Among them were sealed complaints, reports from former students describing emotional abuse and discriminatory remarks, settlement agreements, copies of NDAs that previous schools had used to silence families, testimonies, signed affidavits from former colleagues who had either witnessed or reported Mrs. Collins' behavior. Sarah paused, letting the weight of the evidence settle over the room. "This isn't just about one slap," she concluded. "This is about years of unchecked misconduct, enabled by institutions more concerned with protecting their reputations than their students." The room erupted in murmurs of outrage. Parents shook their heads, and several reporters whispered hurried notes to one another. As the investigation's findings became public, Mrs. Collins's remaining allies began to distance themselves. Maxwell, her aggressive lawyer, officially withdrew from her case, citing irreconcilable differences. News outlets uncovered his role in leaking the fabricated email, further discrediting both him and Mrs. Collins. Without legal counsel, Mrs. Collins was left to face the mounting accusations alone. Her previously confident demeanor crumbled as the community turned against her. At home, she received no support. Her husband had moved out with their children, and her calls to friends went unanswered. Desperation drove Mrs. Collins to a breaking point. Late one evening, she attempted to contact a member of the school board directly, offering what she called a reasonable compromise. The board member, Richard Thompson, immediately reported the call as an attempted bribe. As Mrs. Collins's situation worsened, the community rallied around Jordan and the broader cause of reform. Parents organized nightly gatherings at the local community center, brainstorming ways to hold the school accountable. "We need systemic change," Mr. Daniels told the group one evening. "This can't end with Mrs. Collins. The school needs policies that protect students and empower them to report misconduct without fear." Jordan stood beside his father, presenting an idea he and Tasha had developed together. "What if we create a mentorship program?" he proposed. "Pair teachers with students from diverse backgrounds so they can learn from each other. And we could have regular forums where students can safely voice their concerns." The room erupted in applause. Tasha smiled proudly at Jordan, her earlier nervousness replaced with confidence. "We could also push for stricter accountability measures," she added, "like an independent review board to investigate complaints." By the end of the night, the community had drafted a formal proposal for the school board. It outlined specific steps to prevent future incidents, including mandatory bias training for teachers, anonymous reporting systems, and regular student feedback sessions. Under mounting public pressure, the school board convened an emergency meeting. This time, the focus was not just on Mrs. Collins, but on the school's overall failure to address complaints. Chairwoman Helen Martinez addressed the packed room, her voice steady but tinged with regret. "We acknowledge the serious mistakes made in handling past incidents involving Mrs. Collins. As a board, we failed to act decisively, and for that, we apologize," she continued. "Effective immediately, we are implementing a series of reforms to ensure all students feel safe and respected in our schools. These include the proposals brought forth by the community." The room erupted in applause, but the moment was bittersweet. For many, the acknowledgement of failure came too late to undo the damage caused by years of inaction. The final blow came during the formal hearing to determine Mrs. Collins's teaching license. Held in a large auditorium, the event drew media attention from across the state. Parents, former students, and community members packed the seats, eager to see justice served. Mrs. Collins sat alone at a table, her new, inexperienced lawyer fumbling through his notes. Across the room, Jordan sat with his father and Sarah Chen, their presence a reminder of the overwhelming evidence against her. As testimony unfolded, the narrative became clear. Mrs. Collins's behavior was not an isolated incident, but a deeply ingrained pattern. Witness after witness described her discriminatory practices, and the private investigator's report solidified the case against her. When it was Jordan's turn to speak, he approached the podium with quiet confidence. "What happened to me isn't just about one bad day," he said, his voice steady. "It's about years of being made to feel like I didn't belong. No student should ever feel like they're less than anyone else because of who they are." His words resonated deeply, earning a standing ovation from many in the audience. By the end of the hearing, Mrs. Collins's teaching license was officially revoked, and the school board announced sweeping reforms inspired by the community's proposals. The changes included mandatory teacher training, focused on cultural competency and emotional intelligence, independent oversight, a new board tasked with investigating student complaints, student advocacy programs, mentorship and peer-led initiatives to empower students. For Jordan, the fight had been long and challenging, but the results were undeniable. Standing on the steps of the school board building, he addressed a crowd of supporters and reporters. "This was never just about me," he said. "It was about ensuring every student feels valued and protected. We've taken the first step, but there's still more work to do." Tasha stood beside him, holding a sign that read, "Justice for all starts here." Mr. Daniels placed a proud hand on his son's shoulder as the crowd erupted in applause. The aftermath of the school board's decision rippled far beyond Riverview Academy. News outlets across the state covered the sweeping reforms and the community's stand against systemic failure. Jordan Daniels, once a quiet and studious 8th grader, had become the face of a movement for educational accountability. But for him, the spotlight wasn't a source of pride. It was a responsibility. Jordan sat at the kitchen table, scrolling through his phone. His social media notifications had exploded overnight. Messages of support poured in from former students, parents, and even strangers. One caught his eye. "Your courage inspires us all. Thank you for speaking up. My daughter finally told me about her struggles at school because of you." Tasha, sitting across from him, sipped her coffee. "See?" she said, nudging him playfully. "You're making a difference." Jordan smiled faintly, but didn't look up. "It's just, I didn't do this alone. So many people stepped up to help." "And that's the point," Tasha replied. "You showed people it's okay to speak out. Now they're following your lead." While Jordan's name became synonymous with hope and change, Mrs. Collins's reputation continued to crumble. After her teaching license was revoked, news of her misconduct spread to the districts where she had previously worked. Former colleagues, emboldened by the community's actions, came forward to share their own stories of witnessing her discriminatory behavior. At her now empty home, Mrs. Collins sat in the living room, surrounded by unopened mail and scattered belongings. Her husband's absence loomed over her like a shadow, and the silence was deafening. The house, once a testament to her years of hard work, now felt like a monument to her downfall. A knock at the door startled her. It was her sister, Lisa, the only family member who had reached out since the scandal began. Lisa stepped inside, her face a mix of pity and exasperation. "I brought you some groceries," Lisa said, setting the bags on the counter. "You've got to stop hiding, Karen." Mrs. Collins sank into a chair, her voice trembling. "I didn't mean for it to get this bad. I thought I was doing what was right for my students." Lisa sighed, her patience wearing thin. "Discipline doesn't mean tearing kids down. You crossed the line, Karen, repeatedly, and now you're paying for it." The conversation ended with Lisa leaving abruptly, her frustration palpable. Mrs. Collins sat alone once more, her thoughts circling the ruins of her career and the choices that had led her here. At Riverview Academy, the changes inspired by Jordan and the community were already taking shape. The first meeting of the mentorship program took place in the school's library, where teachers and students sat together in small groups, sharing stories and discussing how to improve classroom dynamics. Jordan and Tasha were paired with Ms. Riley, a new teacher eager to learn from her students. "I want to be better," Ms. Riley admitted. "I don't want to make the mistakes others have made." Tasha smiled warmly. "It's not about being perfect. It's about listening and understanding. That's all we've ever wanted." The program's early success was a testament to the power of collaboration. Students felt heard, teachers gained valuable insights, and a sense of mutual respect began to grow. The broader community also found ways to heal. The weekly forums introduced by the school board became a space for parents, students, and educators to come together and address issues openly. At one forum, a parent stood up and shared her gratitude. "I never thought my voice mattered," she said, her eyes welling with tears. "But this process has shown me that change is possible when we come together." Jordan, seated in the back of the room with his father, felt a surge of pride. He turned to Mr. Daniels and whispered, "This is what we were fighting for." Mr. Daniels nodded, placing a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder. "And it's only the beginning." As the story continued to gain traction, national advocacy groups took notice. Jordan and his father were invited to speak at a conference on educational equity, where they shared their experiences and outlined the reforms Riverview had implemented. Standing on stage in front of hundreds, Jordan felt the familiar butterflies in his stomach. But as he glanced at his father and Tasha in the front row, their supportive smiles calmed him. "This isn't just about one school or one teacher," Jordan began. "It's about creating environments where every student feels valued and safe. Change doesn't happen overnight, but it starts with small, brave steps." The audience erupted in applause, and Jordan's name began circulating in national conversations about educational reform. Months later, Mrs. Collins resurfaced in the news when she filed a lawsuit against the school board, claiming wrongful termination. The case garnered little sympathy, as the overwhelming evidence against her left no room for doubt. At the courthouse, a reporter approached Jordan for a comment. "How do you feel about Mrs. Collins's lawsuit?" they asked. Jordan thought for a moment before responding. "I feel sad for her," he admitted. "But this isn't about her anymore. It's about the students she hurt and the changes we've made to prevent it from happening again." His words resonated deeply, reflecting the maturity and focus that had guided him throughout the ordeal. A year later, Riverview Academy was nearly unrecognizable. The school's culture had shifted dramatically, with students and teachers working together to foster an environment of respect and inclusivity. The mentorship program expanded to other schools in the district, and Riverview became a model for how to address systemic issues head-on. Jordan, now a high school freshman, continued to lead by example. His quiet determination and unwavering principles inspired those around him, and he was often sought out for advice by younger students. One day, as he walked through the school halls, He noticed a group of students gathered around Tasha. She was leading a discussion about the mentorship program, her passion for change shining through. "Looks like you're a natural leader," Jordan said, joining the group with a grin. Tasha laughed. "I learned from the best." Jordan's journey became a story of hope and resilience, proving that even the smallest voices could spark the largest changes. Riverview Academy's transformation was a testament to the power of community, and its legacy served as a reminder that justice, while not always immediate, was always worth pursuing. As for Jordan, his fight wasn't over, but he faced the future with the confidence of someone who had already overcome the unimaginable, and he knew, deep in his heart, that the best was yet to come. The school board chamber was filled to capacity on the morning of the long-awaited final hearing. Every seat was taken, and a quiet tension hung in the air. Parents, teachers, students, and reporters all gathered to witness the culmination of months of revelations, accusations, and community action. At the center of it all sat Mrs. Collins, alone at a small table, her shoulders hunched and her face pale. The board members entered solemnly, their expressions serious as they took their seats. Chairman Stevens, a composed man with sharp features, cleared his throat and began. "This hearing is now in session. We will address the formal accusations against Mrs. Collins, including misconduct, racial bias, and attempts to obstruct this investigation." One by one, former students and teachers approached the podium. Each testimony was a brick in the wall of evidence against Mrs. Collins. A retired teacher shared how she had witnessed Mrs. Collins demean minority students, often publicly. "She masked her actions as discipline," the former colleague stated, but it was clear she held certain students to harsher standards. Several past students recounted their experiences, their voices tinged with pain but also relief as they finally had the chance to be heard. One young man, now in his 20s, described how Mrs. Collins had belittled him for his accent, causing him to avoid speaking in class for years. Another shared how she was once given detention for arriving to class 1 minute late, an infraction that other students routinely got away with. Mr. Daniels stood next, presenting the findings of the private investigator. He held up a thick binder as he addressed the room. "The pattern is undeniable. This isn't about one incident or one moment of poor judgment. This is about years of systematic abuse of power, protected by a culture of silence." As he spoke, Jordan sat between his father and Tasha, his hands gripping the edges of his chair. He watched Mrs. Collins squirm in her seat, her discomfort visible as the weight of the accusations bore down on her. When it was finally Mrs. Collins' turn to speak, she rose unsteadily from her chair. She gripped the edges of the table to steady herself before beginning. "I am being unfairly targeted," she said, her voice thin and reedy. "These accusations are exaggerated. I have dedicated my life to teaching." Her words rang hollow as Chairman Stevens interrupted. "How do you respond to the documented complaints and the testimony we've heard today?" Mrs. Collins faltered. I was under immense pressure to maintain order. You don't understand what it's like." "And what about the attempted bribery of Board Member Thompson?" Stevens pressed, her face flushed crimson. I was desperate," she admitted, her voice breaking. "I didn't know what else to do." The board members exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable. Mrs. Collins's defense crumbled further with each passing moment. Her attempts to justify her actions were met with sharp questions and references to the mounting evidence. After a brief recess, the board returned to deliver their decision. Chairman Stevens leaned into his microphone, his voice steady. "Based on the overwhelming evidence presented, this board will now vote on the revocation of Mrs. Collins' teaching license." The room fell completely silent as each board member cast their vote. Revoke, revoke, revoke. The word rang out 7 times, echoing through the chamber. When the final vote was cast, Chairman Stevens announced, "The decision is unanimous. Mrs. Collins's teaching license is hereby revoked, effective immediately." Applause erupted throughout the room, a cathartic release of months of tension and frustration. Mrs. Collins, her face pale and her hands trembling, gathered her belongings and made her way toward the exit. She paused briefly at the door, her shoulders slumping in defeat before she pushed through and disappeared from view. The news of Mrs. Collins's license revocation spread rapidly through social media and local news outlets. Outside the school board building, parents hugged their children and reporters crowded around Mr. Daniels and Jordan. "This isn't just about one teacher," Mr. Daniels told the gathered press. "This is about making sure every student feels safe and respected in their classroom." Jordan stood tall beside his father, his presence calm but powerful. Tasha stood close by, her face beaming with pride. As students approached Jordan to thank him, many shared their own stories of discrimination, stories they had been too afraid to tell until now. Meanwhile, across town, Mrs. Collins sat in the dim silence of her kitchen. Her phone buzzed incessantly with notifications, each one a reminder of the world outside that no longer welcomed her. Job applications were met with swift rejections, and her bank account was dwindling. A newspaper sat open on the table, its headline glaring, "Justice Served, Educator Stripped of License After Scandal." Her neighbors avoided her, their once friendly greetings replaced with cold indifference. Even the church she had attended for years had quietly removed her from its volunteer roster. That afternoon, an article by journalist Sarah Martinez hit the internet, quickly gaining traction. The piece, titled "Beyond the Collins Case, A System of Silence," explored the larger failures that had allowed Mrs. Collins to continue teaching for so long. "Internal documents reveal a disturbing pattern," Martinez wrote. Administrators at 3 separate schools chose to transfer Mrs. Collins rather than address the serious allegations against her. This raises urgent questions about how many other teachers like her remain protected by this system of willful ignorance. The article included interviews with former administrators who admitted, under anonymity, to prioritizing the school's reputations over student welfare. It also featured testimonies from dozens of former students who had tried to report Mrs. Collins over the years, only to be ignored or silenced. The exposé sent shockwaves through the educational community. Parents flooded school board offices with calls demanding policy reforms. Advocacy groups organized town hall meetings to address systemic failures, and state officials began discussions about introducing stricter oversight for teacher misconduct. As the exposé gained momentum, the Riverview Academy School Board convened an emergency meeting. The community's demands for change were impossible to ignore. Parents, teachers, and students packed the auditorium, their voices unified in calling for systemic reforms. Board Chairman Stevens addressed the crowd, his tone measured but resolute. "We acknowledge that the failures exposed by this case go beyond one individual. Today, we present a comprehensive reform package aimed at ensuring no student ever experiences what Jordan Daniels and others have endured. The reforms included mandatory cultural sensitivity training for all staff, an anonymous reporting system for student concerns, and an independent review board to handle allegations of misconduct. Additionally, the board announced plans to work with student leaders to foster a more inclusive school environment. Jordan Daniels and Tasha were among the student leaders invited to contribute ideas for the reform package. Meeting with board members, they presented proposals that reflected their first-hand experiences. "We need programs that empower students to speak up," Tasha said confidently. "Like peer support groups and regular forums where students can share their concerns safely." Jordan added, "and mentorship programs that pair teachers with students from diverse backgrounds. That way, educators can better understand the perspectives of the kids they're teaching." The board members listened intently, taking notes and asking thoughtful questions. By the end of the meeting, they were unanimous in their support for the students' ideas. "We're not just making policy changes," Chairman Stevens said. "We're changing the culture of our schools." A week after the reforms were announced, the Daniels family held a press conference to unveil the Jordan Daniels Scholarship Fund. The initiative aimed to support minority students facing financial and social barriers in their pursuit of education. Standing at the podium, Mr. Daniels addressed the crowd with pride. "This scholarship is about giving every student a chance to succeed, no matter their background. It's about ensuring that obstacles like bias and discrimination don't stand in the way of their dreams." Jordan, standing beside his father, added, "This isn't just my story. It's the story of so many students who deserve better. This fund is a step toward making that happen." The announcement was met with overwhelming support. Local businesses pledged donations, parents organized fundraisers, and former students shared the initiative widely on social media. Within weeks, the scholarship fund had raised enough to support its first round of recipients. In the months that followed, Riverview Academy underwent a transformation. The new teacher in Mrs. Collins' old classroom, Ms. Thompson, fostered an environment of collaboration and respect. Desks were arranged in small groups, walls were decorated with student artwork, and her lessons emphasized multiple perspectives. "In this class," Ms. Thompson said on her first day, "everyone's voice matters. We're here to learn from each other." Jordan noticed the difference immediately. The tension that had once defined the classroom was gone, replaced by an atmosphere of openness. Students who had previously been hesitant to participate now raised their hands eagerly. The changes extended beyond the classroom. Students formed clubs to celebrate diversity, parents organized cultural awareness events, and teachers participated in workshops to better understand the challenges faced by their students. The entire school community embraced a spirit of growth and accountability. As Riverview Academy moved forward, Mrs. Collins struggled with the consequences of her actions. The article by Sarah Martinez, along with her televised apology, had sparked heated debates about whether she deserved forgiveness or condemnation. One quiet evening, Mrs. Collins sat at her computer and typed a letter addressed to her former students. The letter, titled, "To Those I've Hurt," was raw and unflinching in its honesty. "I've spent weeks reflecting on the damage I caused," she wrote. "My actions were rooted in biases I didn't even realize I held, but ignorance is no excuse. I failed as a teacher, as a mentor, and as a human being. For that, I am deeply sorry." The letter went viral, sparking a range of reactions. Some saw it as a genuine step toward accountability, while others dismissed it as too little, too late. Regardless of public opinion, the letter marked a turning point for Mrs. Collins, who began volunteering at a local community center to support underprivileged children. The culmination of Riverview Academy's transformation came during the school's first annual Diversity and Inclusion Day. The event, led by Jordan and Tasha, featured cultural displays, performances, and interactive workshops. The school courtyard buzzed with activity as students shared stories of their heritage and celebrated their unique identities. Jordan and Tasha moved through the crowd, ensuring everything ran smoothly. Their leadership had grown into a partnership that inspired the entire community. When it was Jordan's turn to speak, he stood at the podium, his voice steady and confident. "We can't change the past," he said, "but we can build a future where every student feels seen, heard, and valued." That's what today is about. The crowd erupted in applause, and as Jordan stepped down, his father pulled him into a proud embrace. "You've done something extraordinary," Mr. Daniels said. "You've created real, lasting change." By the end of the school year, Riverview Academy had become a model for other schools in the district. The changes implemented in the wake of Mrs. Collins's case served as a blueprint for fostering inclusivity and accountability. Jordan, Tasha, and their peers continued to lead the charge, proving that even the youngest voices could make a profound impact. As the community gathered to celebrate the end of the school year, Jordan reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From a single act of courage had grown a movement that transformed not only a school, but an entire community. And for Jordan, this was just the beginning. The school community began to feel the ripple effects of Jordan's stand in ways that went beyond the walls of Riverview Academy. Nearby schools, inspired by the reforms at Riverview, began implementing similar changes. Teachers from across the district attended workshops on cultural sensitivity and inclusive practices. Parent advocacy groups formed alliances, determined to ensure that no student would face discrimination without accountability. Jordan and Tasha found themselves frequently invited to speak at community events. Each time they carried the same message. This isn't about blaming individuals. It's about changing systems. It's about creating schools where everyone feels they belong. Their speeches resonated deeply, sparking conversations in school board meetings and PTA gatherings throughout the region. At Riverview, the mentorship program Jordan and Tasha had proposed was thriving. Teachers and students participated in paired activities designed to foster mutual understanding. During one session, Ms. Thompson shared a story about her first year of teaching, when she'd struggled to connect with a diverse group of students. "I didn't realize then how much I needed to learn from my students," she admitted, "but now I see teaching as a two-way street." Students responded in kind, sharing their perspectives and experiences. For many, it was the first time they felt truly heard by an adult in authority. One student, a shy 7th grader named Elena, found her voice during a discussion on identity. "I've always been embarrassed about my accent," she confessed, "but now I understand it's part of who I am, and that's something to be proud of." Her words were met with applause, and Ms. Thompson smiled warmly, saying, "Thank you, Elena. Your voice makes this room richer." At home, Jordan found himself reflecting more often on the events of the past year. Late one evening, he sat at the kitchen table with his father, the remains of their dinner still on the plates between them. "Dad," Jordan began hesitantly, "do you ever think about how everything might have turned out if I hadn't spoken up?" Mr. Daniels looked at his son thoughtfully before answering. "I think about it all the time," he said. "And I'm grateful every day that you found the courage to say something. You didn't just stand up for yourself, son. You stood up for a better future, for yourself and for everyone around you." Jordan nodded, the weight of his father's words settling over him. "It's just, sometimes I wonder if it really made a difference." His father reached across the table, placing a hand on Jordan's shoulder. "Look around you, Jordan. Look at the students who are finding their voices because of you. Look at the changes happening in this school, in this community. You've made more of a difference than you realize." Jordan smiled faintly, his father's reassurance grounding him. He excused himself and headed upstairs, where his bedroom wall had become a collage of memories, photos of classmates, articles about the reforms, and a poster Tasha had made that read, "Change starts with us." Jordan stared at the wall for a long moment before pinning a new addition. A thank you note from a student he barely knew, thanking him for creating a school where it feels safe to just be myself. The scholarship fund also began to grow beyond its initial scope. Donations poured in from alumni, local businesses, and even national organizations. The first round of recipients included students from diverse backgrounds, each with their own story of resilience and determination. At the scholarship ceremony, Maria Rodriguez, one of the recipients, spoke about how the fund had changed her life. "This isn't just financial support," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "It's a message that someone believes in me, that I belong." As Maria stepped off the stage, Jordan met her eyes and nodded, his expression one of quiet pride. Tasha leaned over and whispered, "You did this, Jordan. You made this possible." Jordan shook his head. "We did this," he corrected her. "All of us." Mrs. Collins, meanwhile, continued her own journey of reckoning and self-reflection. Volunteering at the community center became a small but meaningful part of her routine. At first, the children were wary of her, their skepticism evident in the way they kept their distance. But over time, as Mrs. Collins approached her role with patience and humility, she began to earn their trust. One afternoon, a boy named Jamal approached her tentatively. "Can you help me with my reading?" he asked, holding up a worn book. Mrs. Collins smiled, her voice soft but steady. "Of course," she said, pulling up a chair. As they worked together, other children began to join, curious to see the stern woman who was slowly transforming into a gentle guide. At the end of the day, Jamal handed Mrs. Collins a drawing he had made, a simple picture of the two of them sitting together, surrounded by books. "Thanks for not giving up on me," he said shyly. Mrs. Collins felt a lump form in her throat as she realized how much those words meant, not just to Jamal, but to herself as well. She had spent so much of her career giving up on the very students she was supposed to uplift. Now she was determined to do better. The broader community continued to heal, with Riverview serving as a beacon of progress. The first annual Diversity and Inclusion Day became a cornerstone of the school calendar, bringing together students, parents, and educators to celebrate the richness of their shared experiences. Booths showcasing different cultures lined the school gym, and performances highlighted traditions from around the world. Jordan and Tasha co-hosted the event, their partnership a testament to the strength of their friendship and shared vision. During the closing ceremony, Principal Grant addressed the crowd, his voice filled with emotion. Today we celebrate not just diversity, but the courage it takes to embrace it fully, and we owe much of this transformation to the leadership and vision of two remarkable students, Jordan Daniels and Tasha Williams. The audience erupted in applause as Jordan and Tasha stepped forward. Tasha spoke first, her usual shyness replaced with a quiet confidence. "This isn't just about celebrating who we are," she said. "It's about creating a future where everyone feels they belong." Jordan followed, his voice steady and resolute. "Change starts with small steps. It starts with conversations, with standing up for what's right, and with believing in each other. Together, we've shown that change is possible, and I know this is only the beginning." As the event came to a close, the crowd dispersed with a renewed sense of purpose. Parents chatted animatedly, students shared photos and stories, and teachers reflected on how far they had come. For Jordan, the day felt like a culmination of everything they had worked for, a moment to pause and appreciate, even as he looked ahead to the work still to be done. That evening, as the sun set over Riverview, Jordan stood outside the school with Tasha and his father. The three of them watched as the last of the day's attendees drove away, the faint sounds of laughter and conversation lingering in the air. "You know," Tasha said, breaking the silence, "I think this is what hope feels like." Jordan smiled, his heart full. "Yeah," he agreed. "It really does." As the weeks passed, the positive momentum at Riverview Academy showed no signs of slowing. The newly established reforms began to take root, and the school's atmosphere transformed in ways both subtle and profound. Students, once hesitant to speak up, now felt empowered to share their ideas. Teachers collaborated more closely with their classes, incorporating feedback to create lessons that resonated deeply. Jordan and Tasha became unofficial ambassadors for the school's change initiatives. During their lunch breaks, they led peer mentoring sessions in the library, where students shared their experiences and brainstormed ways to further improve their school environment. At one session, a sixth grader named Naomi spoke up about her struggles adjusting to a new school. "I felt invisible," Naomi admitted, her voice shaking slightly. "But when I saw how people rallied behind Jordan, it gave me hope that maybe things could be different." Tasha leaned forward, her voice warm and encouraging. "You're not invisible, Naomi. You matter, and your voice is just as important as anyone else's." Jordan nodded in agreement. "Change starts when we support each other. That's what this space is for." Across town, Mrs. Collins continued her slow journey toward redemption. Her days volunteering at the community center were often humbling, but they also provided her with moments of unexpected clarity. One afternoon, as she helped a group of children paint murals, a girl named Layla hesitated before showing her work. "It's probably not good enough," Layla murmured, her gaze fixed on the floor. Mrs. Collins crouched beside her, taking in the vibrant colors and bold brushstrokes of Layla's painting. "This is beautiful," she said sincerely. "You have a real talent, Layla. Never doubt that." The girl's eyes brightened, and for the first time, Mrs. Collins felt a small but meaningful shift within herself. Encouraging Layla felt like a step toward becoming the teacher she had failed to be for so many years. Meanwhile, the Jordan Daniels Scholarship Fund continued to grow, attracting national attention for its mission and impact. The first recipients of the scholarship sent heartfelt letters of thanks, many sharing how the support had opened doors they never thought possible. One letter came from a student named Miguel, who had been on the verge of dropping out due to financial struggles. "This scholarship saved my education," Miguel wrote. "But more than that, it made me believe that I'm worth investing in. Thank you for seeing me." Jordan read the letter aloud to his father and Tasha one evening, his voice filled with emotion. "This is why we started it," he said, folding the letter carefully. "It's not just about money. It's about showing people they're valued." Tasha smiled, her pride evident. "You're making a bigger impact than you realize, Jordan." The annual Diversity and Inclusion Day became a highly anticipated event at Riverview Academy, drawing students, parents, and even visitors from neighboring schools. This year, the event featured workshops, performances, and interactive exhibits that celebrated the richness of their community's cultures. Jordan and Tasha co-led a workshop on allyship and advocacy, where they shared practical tips on standing up for others. "It's not always easy," Jordan said, addressing the group. "But doing the right thing rarely is. What matters is that we try." After the workshop, a seventh grader named Liam approached them hesitantly. "I want to stand up for my friends," he said, "but sometimes I get scared." Tasha placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Courage isn't about not being scared," she said. "It's about doing what's right, even when you are." Back at Riverview, the impact of the mentorship program became increasingly evident. Ms. Thompson, who had taken over Mrs. Collins' former class, became a beloved figure among her students. She fostered an environment of mutual respect and curiosity, where every student felt valued. During one class discussion, she asked her students to share personal stories that connected to the historical events they were studying. Jordan raised his hand and spoke about how his father's guidance had taught him to stand tall in the face of injustice. His words inspired other students to open up, creating a dialogue that deepened their understanding of both history and each other. In the cafeteria, students who once sat in isolated groups now mingled freely. New friendships blossomed, and a sense of unity replaced the divisions that had once plagued the school. Teachers reported a noticeable shift in classroom dynamics, with students showing greater empathy and collaboration. As Riverview Academy thrived, the Daniels family took quiet moments to reflect on how far they had come. One evening, as Jordan and his father sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and pink, Mr. Daniels turned to his son with a thoughtful expression. "You know, Jordan," he said, "what you've done here, it's not just about this school. You've started something much bigger. You've shown people that change is possible, even when it feels impossible." Jordan looked out at the horizon, his heart full. "I just wanted to make things better," he said simply. His father smiled, his pride unmistakable. "And you have, more than you know." Even as the school year drew to a close, the momentum at Riverview showed no signs of slowing. Students continued to lead initiatives, teachers embraced new approaches, and parents remained actively involved in shaping the school's future. The changes sparked by Jordan's stand had grown into a movement, a testament to the power of courage and community. And as Jordan prepared to move on to high school, he carried with him the knowledge that his voice had made a difference, not just for himself, but for generations to come. As summer approached, the echoes of Riverview Academy's transformation reached far and wide. Local news outlets revisited the story, highlighting the school's remarkable journey from controversy to a beacon of progress. National education blogs and magazines wrote articles with headlines like "From Crisis to Change," "How One School Reimagined Inclusion," and "The Student Who Sparked a Movement." Jordan Daniels became a name recognized well beyond his town, though he remained grounded in the community that had supported him. Tasha, energized by her experiences working alongside Jordan, continued to flourish as a leader. She won her student council election with overwhelming support and immediately set to work on a series of initiatives aimed at fostering open communication between students and staff. Her confidence grew with each project, and she often credited Jordan for inspiring her to step into her potential. One afternoon, as they sat under the old oak tree in the park where they often met, Tasha turned to Jordan. "Do you ever think about what things would be like if none of this had happened?" she asked. pulling up a blade of grass and twirling it between her fingers. Jordan considered the question, his gaze distant. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but I don't think about it as regret. I think about how everything that's happened has shown me what's possible when people come together. It's made me believe in something bigger than myself." Tasha nodded. "Me too. It's like we've seen what change can look like, and now we have to keep pushing for more." The ripple effect of Riverview's changes continued to grow. Other schools in the district adopted mentorship programs, anonymous reporting systems, and mandatory cultural competency training for their staff. Teachers began incorporating lessons about social justice and equity into their curriculums, sparking important conversations in classrooms across the region. Parents became more engaged than ever, forming advocacy groups that worked closely with school administrators. At one meeting, a mother shared how her son, who had struggled with feeling excluded at school, was now thriving under the new programs. "He finally feels like he belongs," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "That's all we ever wanted." At Riverview, the scholarship fund had expanded far beyond its initial goals. With the influx of donations, the fund now supported not just tuition assistance, but also leadership training, extracurricular opportunities, and community-building projects for students. During a summer event celebrating the fund's success, one of the new recipients, a young girl named Aliyah, shared her gratitude. "I used to think my dreams didn't matter," Aliyah said, her voice steady despite the crowd. "But this scholarship has shown me that people believe in me, and now I believe in myself." Jordan, seated beside his father, felt a wave of emotion as he listened. Each story reminded him why they had fought so hard, not for recognition, but for moments like these, where hope was restored. Meanwhile, Mrs. Collins remained quietly in the background, her life a shadow of what it had once been. She continued volunteering at the community center, her interactions with the children there providing small glimpses of redemption. While many still regarded her with skepticism, others began to see her as someone trying to make amends. One afternoon, Jamal, the boy she had helped with his reading, asked her a surprising question. "Why are you here every day?" he asked, tilting his head. "Don't you have something else to do?" Mrs. Collins hesitated, then replied honestly, "I'm here because I need to make up for the mistakes I've made, and because helping you and the other kids, it helps me too." Jamal studied her for a moment before nodding. "Well, you're pretty good at helping with math," he said with a small smile. For Mrs. Collins, it wasn't absolution, but it was a start. Back at Riverview, preparations were underway for the next school year, and the energy was palpable. Ms. Thompson, the teacher who had taken over Mrs. Collins's classroom, collaborated with students to design new projects that celebrated inclusivity and diversity. One initiative involved creating a wall of voices where students could share their stories, ideas, and artwork. Jordan and Tasha contributed their own pieces to the wall, with Tasha writing a poem about resilience and Jordan sharing a letter of encouragement to future students. "No matter where you come from," he wrote, "your voice matters. Use it to make this school, this world, a better place." The wall quickly became a centerpiece of the school, with students from all grades contributing. It served as a constant reminder of the power of shared voices and collective action. As summer turned into fall, Jordan prepared to transition to high school. The thought of leaving Riverview brought mixed emotions. On one hand, he was eager to embrace new challenges and opportunities. On the other, he felt a deep connection to the school and community he had helped transform. During a farewell event held in his honor, Jordan addressed the gathered students, teachers, and parents. "Riverview will always be a part of who I am," he said. "But this isn't just about me. This is about all of us. The work we've done together doesn't end here. It carries on in every one of you." As he stepped down from the stage, the crowd erupted in applause. Tasha was waiting for him, her eyes bright. "You're going to do amazing things in high school," she said. "But don't forget about us." "Never," Jordan replied, pulling her into a hug. The night before his first day of high school, Jordan sat in his room, surrounded by mementos from the past year. The thank you notes, newspaper clippings, and photos reminded him of the journey that had brought him to this point. He felt a mix of nerves and excitement for what lay ahead, but also a deep sense of purpose. Before going to bed, he added one final piece to his wall of memories: a small card Tasha had given him earlier that day. It read, "You didn't just change the school, you changed lives, keep going." Jordan smiled as he pinned the card to the wall, the words a steady reminder of the path he was on. No matter where life took him, he knew one thing for certain. His voice had power, and he would continue to use it to create a better world for everyone. As Jordan adjusted to high school, he quickly realized that his reputation had preceded him. Teachers and students alike treated him with a mix of admiration and curiosity. While some welcomed him openly, others approached him cautiously, unsure of what to expect from the young man whose story had sparked so much change. In his first week, a teacher pulled him aside after class. "I've read about what you've done, Jordan," she said, her tone kind. "I just want you to know, if you ever feel like something needs to be addressed here, my door is always open." Jordan nodded, appreciating the sentiment but also feeling the weight of the unspoken expectations that came with it. He hadn't set out to be a leader, but now the role felt as natural as breathing. As the weeks went on, he found ways to make an impact even in this new environment. One of his first projects in high school was joining a student-led initiative to improve the inclusivity of the school's clubs and extracurricular activities. Jordan noticed that certain groups, particularly students from minority backgrounds, weren't participating as much as others. "I think some students feel like these spaces aren't meant for them," Jordan suggested during a brainstorming session. "What if we created an outreach program to actively invite them to join?" The team ran with his idea, organizing an event where every club set up booths to showcase what they offered. Club members personally invited students from underrepresented groups, making an effort to ensure everyone felt welcome. By the end of the event, participation numbers had risen significantly, and students who had never joined clubs before were signing up enthusiastically. Jordan saw the smiles on their faces and felt a familiar sense of purpose. He wasn't just contributing to his new school, he was building on the foundation he'd laid at Riverview. Back in his old neighborhood, Riverview Academy continued to thrive under the reforms Jordan and his peers had helped implement. Tasha, now a prominent figure in the middle school's leadership, sent him frequent updates about the school's progress. "Guess what?" she wrote in one message. "We just finished our first student advocacy group meeting. Over 30 students showed up. You wouldn't believe how many ideas they had for making the school even better." Jordan smiled as he read her messages, proud of how much she had grown into her role. He replied, "That's amazing, Tasha. You're doing exactly what we hoped for, making sure everyone has a voice." Meanwhile, the Jordan Daniels Scholarship Fund continued to expand, now supporting students in multiple schools across the district. At the latest scholarship ceremony, a recipient named Elijah shared his story. "I was ready to give up on school," Elijah admitted, his voice trembling. "But this scholarship made me realize that someone believed in me. It gave me a reason to keep going." As Elijah stepped off the stage, Mr. Daniels stood beside his son, their bond as strong as ever. "You've created something incredible here," Mr. Daniels said, his voice filled with pride. "This is going to change lives for years to come." Mrs. Collins' journey of atonement continued quietly. She spent more time volunteering at the community center, where her patience and humility began to win over even the most skeptical children. One day, as she helped a group of students with their homework, a boy named Carlos asked her, "Do you ever miss being a teacher?" Mrs. Collins paused, considering her answer carefully. "I miss the chance to help students grow," she said, "but I also know I wasn't the teacher I should have been. Now, I'm trying to make up for that." Carlos nodded thoughtfully. "Well, you're a pretty good teacher here," he said, and Mrs. Collins felt a small spark of hope. While she could never undo the harm she had caused, Moments like these reminded her that redemption was a journey, not a destination. As Riverview's culture of inclusivity grew stronger, so did the bonds within the community. The annual Diversity and Inclusion Day became a celebrated tradition, with neighboring schools sending representatives to learn from Riverview's example. Jordan and Tasha were invited back as guest speakers, their speeches inspiring yet another wave of action. Standing on the auditorium stage, Jordan looked out at the crowd of eager faces. "What we've done here isn't just about one school," he said. "It's about showing what's possible when we work together. Change starts small, but when we believe in it, and in each other, it grows into something unstoppable." The audience erupted into applause, and as Jordan stepped down, Tasha grinned at him. "Still as inspiring as ever," she teased. Jordan laughed. "And you're still keeping everything running smoothly." Back in high school, Jordan found himself stepping into new roles. He joined the debate team, where his ability to articulate ideas and connect with others quickly made him a standout. His teammates admired his calm under pressure, and his coach often called him a natural leader. During one competition, Jordan was asked to argue in favor of community-driven change. Drawing on his experiences at Riverview, he spoke passionately about the power of grassroots action. "Real change doesn't start in boardrooms or government offices," Jordan said. "It starts with everyday people standing up for what's right. It starts with conversations, with courage, and with believing in our ability to make a difference." The audience was captivated, and Jordan's team won the debate. As he left the stage, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The lessons he had learned at Riverview weren't just relevant, they were universal. Months later, as Riverview prepared to celebrate another year of progress, Jordan received a message from Principal Grant. "We'd like to honor you at this year's Diversity and Inclusion Day," the message read. "Your legacy continues to inspire us." When the day arrived, Jordan returned to his old school, greeted by familiar faces and a warm sense of homecoming. He and Tasha stood side by side as the crowd cheered their arrival. During the ceremony, Principal Grant unveiled a new addition to the school, a mural depicting students of all backgrounds standing together under the words, "One voice can spark a movement." The mural included images of Jordan and Tasha, their contributions forever memorialized. As Jordan looked at the mural, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. What had begun as a single act of defiance had grown into something far greater, a movement that would continue to inspire long after he and his peers had moved on. Tasha nudged him playfully. "So, how does it feel to be a legend?" Jordan laughed, his humility intact. "It feels like we still have work to do." Tasha nodded, her smile widening. "And I can't think of anyone better to lead the way."